This video is an introduction to Newton's laws of motion, and I'll also spend a little time on the first law of motion in this video, and then the next two videos will be the second law and the third law. Newton's laws of motion are actually, I think it's better to say, these are laws for objects in motion. It's not just about motion. So objects in motion. And in particular, these objects have mass. They are made out of material, and they are matter, and so we assign a mass value to these objects. You can have more mass, 10 kilograms, or less mass, like 1 kilogram. Kilograms is the unit of mass. So these laws of motion that Newton came up with, there are three of them. They come as a set, so a set of three. And they're referred to as the first law, the second law, and the third law. It's interesting to point out that they are a complete description of how to think about objects in motion. They're self-consistent. That is, the second law will never refute or say something opposite the first law, for example. They're very simple, which physicists really enjoy having. And they're also predictive. That is, you can predict the future with them. You can also predict the past before you go and look at it. Another thing you can say about Newton's laws of motion is, in some sense, they define mass and force, and so these are interesting concepts in physics. And in a sense, Newton's laws define what mass and force and their relationship with motion. I think it's important to point out here, and you've likely detected this in previous videos, that when I say motion, I really mean the instantaneous velocity. So the symbol I'll use is this lowercase v, and I put an arrow because instantaneous velocity is a vector, like this. So they define, these laws of motion, they define mass and force and their relationship with motion, and also how the motion changes. And motion changing is referred to as acceleration. And in particular, it really is an instantaneous acceleration. And the symbol that I give or use for that is this lowercase a with the arrow on top. It's the acceleration vector. So after this introduction, I'm going to start describing the first law of motion, the first of the three. So the first law of motion, a lot of people say, and I agree, it is a foundational statement. And So it's important. That's what foundational statement means. And in particular, the first law of motion is actually just a statement of what is meant by a very special word called inertia. When I think of inertia, I think of inertia as the name. So inertia is the name of a phenomenon. That is, it's an occurrence that happens in nature. I'm going to describe what this phenomenon looks like. And the way I'm going to describe it is actually, I'm just going to say what the first law of motion is. The first law of motion is a description of this phenomenon. What's more is Newton identified this phenomenon as fundamental to how nature works. It's a fundamental description of what happens in nature, and it always happens. Nature never does not do inertia. Nature always does this phenomenon of inertia. Problem is it's actually quite hard to recognize it. It goes back, famous names involved are Galilei, so Galileo G, his last name is Galilei. Newton, we're talking about right now, but it goes back. And people have been thinking about this. I don't know, there's records 500 years of thinking through it. And Rene Descartes is another person. I'm not sure where Rene fits in the timeline. But yeah, so this is a Cartesian coordinate system, Descartes. So yeah, inertia is the name of a phenomenon, and the first law of motion claims it as its foundational statement. So I'm going to now write out what this law of inertia is. It actually describes the phenomenon of inertia. So I'll say this is the first law, and I'm going to write it in two different statements. So the first statement that I'll write is an object's motion will not change unless there is a non-zero net force acting on the object. Non-zero net force on the object. That's one statement I'll write. And another statement I'll write is going to seem really similar. I'll describe, but actually they're not different. It's just a different way to say the same thing. An object's motion will accelerate. So it will accelerate whenever the net force on it is not zero. So one thing that I think is important to point out, and it's this, an object's motion, and remember when we say motion, this is the instantaneous velocity. So the velocity will accelerate, that is, the velocity will change whenever the net force on it is not zero. Up here, an object's motion, again, this is the velocity of the object. The velocity will not change unless there is a non-zero net force on the object. So this is exhaustive. It tells you when it will not change, and it tells you when it will change. It will accelerate. So there are no other in-between cases. It's complete. It describes all possible cases for whether or not an object's motion will change, and that that decision point is made based on the value of the net force, and it's whether or not the net force on the object is zero or not. Yeah. So very quickly, we can translate into this slightly more mathematical looking language. Yeah, why not? Because we're physicists and it's fun to have some math around. So let me write it this way. Whenever the net force on the object, so this all little subscript here is just description. We're talking about the sum of the forces acting upon a particular object. This is a vector quantity. Whenever F net on an object is 0, we can say that that tells us that the velocity of the object is constant. Let's say it that way. So is constant. That is, if I took the time derivative, I will only ever get 0. But remember that the time derivative of the velocity is in fact the acceleration. That is, if F net on the object is 0, then the acceleration is 0. Whenever F net on the object is not 0, this implies that the velocity of the object is not constant. And when a function is not constant with respect to a variable like the time, that means that whenever you take the derivative, you're not going to get 0. That is, the acceleration is not 0. That is, the motion is changing.